A report investigating more than 50 years of allegations against Jimmy Savile has detailed 34 crimes of rape and 126 indecent acts. The youngest victim, a boy of just 8. The NSPCC, who produced the report together with the police, is calling Savile one of the most prolific sex offenders it has ever come across. He targeted his victims mostly in the 1960s and 70s, at the BBC, at schools, hospitals, even a hospice. But the sexual abuse also took place as recently as 4 years ago. The Crown Prosecution Service has admitted that Savile could have been brought to justice while he was still alive and apologised to his many victims. David Sillito reports.
Jimmy Savile, a predatory sex offender. His first recorded assault, 1955. The last, 2009. Today's police report is the clearest picture yet of Savile's crimes.
It's clear that their testimony, when taken together, presents a compelling case of a predatory sex offender across the whole of the UK. It could be said he groomed a nation. He was hiding in plain sight, and yet none of us were able to do anything about it.
If you think it's right to make love before you get married, put your hands in the air. I see. Well, look, a few hands creeping up there.
Indeed, in the 70s, Savile was the obvious choice to host a TV debate on teenagers and sex. On his days off, he was visiting places such as this, Duncroft, an approved school for girls. The numbers are bewildering. 450 people have come forward. 328 were children at the time. 214 crimes have been reported, 34 rapes. The youngest victim was 8. And on it goes. Hundreds must have known something.
You have to be quite brave, don't you, at that point, to say, I suspect something, I'm worried, and then tell somebody, because you worry about the consequences, you worry about what might happen next. And that's pretty much what happened for nearly 6 decades in the case of Jimmy Savile.
Of course, there were suspicions. Louis Theroux tackled the topic.
Isn't he a paedophile line, basically?
Yes. Oh, how do they know whether I am or not?
But when women from Duncroft went to the police in 2007, no prosecution was brought. Today, the Crown Prosecution Service apologised. But what did change things was when those women from Duncroft spoke on a TV documentary.
What they triggered was an avalanche. Hundreds upon hundreds have come forward with their stories about the dark side of Jimmy Savile. This isn't justice, but at least they have been heard.
14 offences were in schools, some of them chosen from letters to Jim'll Fix It. You can't prosecute a dead man, but this is perhaps the closest we'll ever get to the truth. David Sillito, BBC News.
We're at the heart of today's report of victims who weren't listened to, institutions that failed to protect them, and law enforcement that didn't work. It's being described by the Crown Prosecution Service as a watershed moment, but will anything be different from now on? Here's our Home Editor, Mark Easton.
The fact that Savile could sexually abuse, assault or rape hundreds of people over 6 decades inside public institutions without the police or prosecutors doing anything seems almost incredible. And for his victims, it is indeed credibility which is the issue at the heart of this scandal. Today's report says the vast majority of Savile's victims did not feel they could speak out, and the small number who did had their accounts dismissed by those in authority. Most victims simply didn't think people would believe them. There was a moment in the midst of Savile's offending when an opportunity was missed. In the late 70s, a policeman was approached by a nurse from Stoke Mandeville who said Savile was touching little girls. The policeman told his superiors.
I was not believed. No. I think purely because at that stage, and for many, many years, of course, Savile was an icon.
A few years later, another missed opportunity. Police apparently told Jimmy Savile had assaulted a girl in his camper van at BBC Television Centre. Then in 2003, a woman told police Savile had groped her on Top of the Pops 30 years earlier. And then, between 2007 and 2009, police in Surrey and Sussex were told of 4 sexual assaults. Again, nothing was done, even though Savile was still committing offences.
I'm very, very angry that he got away with it. They were told what he was doing, but it just got swept under the carpet.
Today, police and prosecutors apologised for their mistakes. An inquiry for the Crown Prosecution Service said victims and their accounts had been treated with caution which was neither justified nor required. The CPS says the approach to credibility in sexual assault cases now has to change.
People still have an attitude towards how they depict certain victims of abuse in a way that isn't necessarily a responsible approach. And I would be wary of saying that the Savile inquiry represents a watershed.
Today's report lists 13 hospitals where Savile is alleged to have committed sexual offences, including Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital and a number of psychiatric units.
Hello, good evening. A senior policeman used the language of those who spend their lives investigating sex abusers. Jimmy Savile, he said, had groomed our nation. He was referring to revelations of the horrific extent of Savile's lifelong reign of sexual abuse, but also revealed today how the opportunities to stop him and prosecute him were missed.
Two reports expose how over 6 decades Savile ruthlessly exploited teenagers and children, one as young as 8, on a scale never before seen in the United Kingdom. In a moment, the shocking truth about why Savile was never brought to justice. But first, our UK editor Lucy Manning reports on the prolific predator who used his celebrity to hide in plain sight.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome indeed to Jimmo Fix-It.
He was the UK's most prolific predatory sex offender. The man who appeared on our screens was in fact hiding in plain sight. Jimmy Savile, far from entertaining the nation, was, say the police, for 6 decades, spending every waking minute thinking about abusing boys and girls.
Jimmy Savile was a predatory sex offender. He was prolific in his abusing of the vulnerable and the exploiting of his power to get access to the vulnerable. His footprint of offending across the UK and the number of offences recorded is unprecedented. He took the nation in. Indeed, you could say he groomed the nation.
The figures are both appalling and staggering. 450 people came forward. 214 crimes against Savile were recorded. 174 of the victims were female, 40 were male. 28 of his victims were under the age of 10. His youngest victim, an 8-year-old boy, his oldest, was 47. Savile's abuse continued wherever he went. 50 allegations were made of abuse in 13 hospitals and in one hospice, the Wheatfield Hospice in Leeds, and claims of abuse in 14 schools and, of course, at the BBC. Yet the police and prosecutors were on to Savile while he was still alive, interviewing him in 2009, yet did nothing. He continued to abuse children up until that very year.
He hid behind a veil of eccentricity and fame and essentially conned and misled children, parents, friends, right up to and including the Prime Minister of the day. And that's how he got away with it, because it's really hard to challenge someone in that circumstance.
Jim wasn't fixing it for children. He was breaking some of them and their trust. Lucy Manning, ITV News.
The Crown Prosecution Service admitted today it passed up at least 3 chances to bring Savile to court. The opportunities went begging, it said, because the victims who came forward were treated with unjustified caution. As Juliette Bremner reports, one of the consequences was that the victims were not told of each other's existence and so felt afraid to press their case.
It was the abuse of vulnerable teenagers living here in the 1970s that first alerted the world to the crimes of Jimmy Savile. But it would be nearly half a century before pupils at Duncroft Approved School, as it was known, were finally believed. Girls like Frances Jennings, abused soon after this photo was taken, were told by teachers to stop lying.
There's nothing worse than not being believed, and a lot of them thought they would just never be believed because he was such a powerful person.
In fact, Savile was seen in such a shimmering light that everyone in authority appears to have been reluctant to pursue allegations, even when they had more than one victim. When former pupils at the old Duncroft Children's Home first made their allegations in 2007, it was decided there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. Part of the problem was that the victims didn't want to go to court, but they now say they would have been more confident if they'd known there were other similar allegations. And the boss of the CPS says they must take a more robust approach. Ray Jones says you only have to look at the recent case of young girls being groomed in Rochdale to know it's still going wrong.
We also know from Rochdale, for example, it's been happening more recently. Young girls have been abused by men who have been able to keep that abuse quiet. It's very difficult for young people to speak about abuse. Powerful men, Savile was one, but other men as well, can be intimidating, they can have credibility. Young people often don't. So I do fear it may still be happening.
The Director of Public Prosecutions accepts they could have stopped Savile earlier and is promising this will be a watershed in their approach to sexual abuse.